December 27th, 1942. The skies over Buna. 22-year-old Richard Bong is flying a borrowed P-38 Lightning when he dives from the clouds, claims his first 2 aerial victories, and instantly speeds away. The Japanese A6M Zero could effortlessly outturn his heavy American fighter in almost any slow-speed dogfight. But Bong survives and wins by doing something completely counterintuitive. He strikes from above and vanishes before the enemy can even react, deliberately refusing to engage in a turning fight. He survives by ignoring the natural instinct of aerial combat entirely. How did refusing to dogfight become the exact tactic that broke Japanese air power? When a military force encounters an enemy fighter plane with unparalleled maneuverability, the natural, almost inescapable instinct is to try and match it. If the adversary builds a machine that turns tight, aerospace engineers rush to design an airframe that turns even tighter. For a fighter pilot, the classic horizontal dogfight, the swirling, twisting, edge-of-your-seat turning engagement is the ultimate test of aerial skill. It is what they are trained for, what they visualize, and what the very culture of combat aviation celebrates. But the Imperial Japanese Navy had perfected the absolute ultimate instrument for this exact arena. Their premier fighter was a machine so perfectly balanced for the horizontal merge that any Allied pilot who willingly accepted a traditional, slow-speed turning fight was actively choosing to play by the enemy's rules. They were stepping into a ring where the physics were completely stacked against them, and the outcome was almost always predetermined. It was a guaranteed death sentence. Survival in the Pacific theater required a profound psychological and tactical reset. The Americans had to accept a bitter truth. They were not going to outfly the enemy in a traditional dogfight. The solution was not to find a better turning radius. The solution was to refuse the turn altogether. The counterintuitive logic of warfare sometimes dictates that the only way to defeat a master is to never, ever play their game. But this raises a fascinating, complex challenge. How exactly does a military force fundamentally rewire the deeply ingrained combat instincts of its young aviators while actively fighting a losing war? How did the United States take the most lethal, defining aerodynamic characteristic of the Japanese aviation fleet and systematically isolate it, turning a masterful advantage into an asset that the enemy was virtually unable to use in combat? To understand how this counterintuitive logic was forged in real time under extreme pressure and how a radical doctrinal shift rescued the American air campaign from the brink of total collapse, we have to look back at the unforgiving, bloody early months of the Pacific War. In the opening weeks of 1942, the skies over the Pacific were not just a battleground, they were a site of systematic execution. As Japanese forces rapidly expanded their empire across the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and the malaria-choked coastlines of New Guinea, Allied aviation found itself facing an absolute catastrophe. Young American aviators arrived in the theater carrying a doctrine built entirely on the romanticized legacy of the First World War. Their training manuals, their squadron commanders, and the very culture of military aviation had ingrained one singular, unshakable truth into their minds. Fighter combat was a turning fight. When you meet the enemy, you merge, you bank hard, you manage your throttle, and you pull your nose through the horizon until you lock onto his tail. This was the holy grail of the pursuit pilot. The Americans were flying the Bell P-39 Airacobra and the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. These were rugged, heavy machines. They were built with heavy armor plating behind the pilot, thick, bullet-resistant glass in the canopy, and self-sealing fuel tanks designed to take a beating and bring the pilot home. But because of this survivability, they were heavily weighted. And yet, the pilots strapped into these flying tanks fully expected to use them like nimble, fabric-covered biplanes. They flew into combat over the Pacific, fully expecting to enter a chaotic, horizontal wrestling match. Waiting for them in that horizontal arena was a machine specifically engineered to punish that exact assumption. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was not just a technologically advanced airplane, It was the physical manifestation of a singular, uncompromising aerodynamic philosophy. Japanese naval designers, led by the brilliant engineer Jiro Horikoshi, had been operating under incredibly strict requirements from the Imperial Japanese Navy. They needed a carrier-based fighter with immense operational range to cover the vast distances of the Pacific, and it had to possess absolutely unmatched maneuverability. To achieve this, Horikoshi and his team made ruthless, lethal calculations. They sacrificed everything that did not directly contribute to agility or distance. They omitted the heavy steel armor plating behind the pilot's seat. They left out the heavy rubber liners required for self-sealing fuel tanks, meaning a single incendiary bullet could ignite the aviation gas and turn the aircraft into a brilliant fireball. Furthermore, they built the airframe from a newly developed, highly secret aluminum alloy called extra super duralumin. This allowed them to integrate the wings and the fuselage into a single, seamless structure, shedding critical pounds. The resulting fighter possessed a wing loading, the ratio of the aircraft's weight to its wing area, that was shockingly low. It defied Western engineering conventions. When the Zero flew at slow to medium speeds, its large control surfaces gave the pilot a level of aerodynamic authority that bordered on the supernatural. It could carve a circle in the sky that was physically impossible for any American fighter in production to follow. When a green American pilot in a heavy P-40 spotted a flight of Zeros over the dense jungles of the Pacific, the trap was sprung before a single shot was fired. It started with sheer instinct. The American would see the iconic red suns on the white wings, grip the control stick, and yank it back, throwing his heavy fighter into a steep, banking turn to try and angle in behind the Japanese formation. By doing this, by voluntarily entering a slow-speed, horizontal turning engagement, the American pilot was actively signing his own death warrant. He was voluntarily choosing to play the exact game the Zero was explicitly designed to win. The physics of this encounter were brutally unforgiving. As the heavy P-40 banked, the immense drag of the maneuver rapidly bled off its airspeed. The American pilot would strain against the G-forces, looking over his shoulder through the canopy plexiglass, fully expecting to see the enemy fighter sliding to the outside of the turn, unable to keep up the pace. Instead, he would see a nightmare. The Zero was not just keeping up, it was casually, effortlessly cutting inside his turning radius. The Japanese pilot, often a seasoned combat veteran with hundreds of flight hours logged over the skies of China, did not even have to push his aircraft to its structural limits. He would simply ease back on his stick, letting the lightweight Zero float gracefully through the turn. Panic would immediately set in inside the American cockpit. The P-40 pilot would pull harder on the yoke, desperately trying to tighten his circle to stay alive. But a heavy aircraft at low speed does not turn tighter when you pull harder. It stalls. The Warhawk would begin to shudder violently, its wings buffeting as the airflow separated from the metal, the heavy liquid-cooled nose threatening to drop like a stone toward the jungle canopy below. The Zero, meanwhile, was still flying perfectly comfortably within its aerodynamic envelope. The Japanese pilot would effortlessly walk his rudder pedals, align his nose, and squeeze the firing trigger. The Zero was armed with twin 20mm cannons in the wings, terrifyingly destructive weapons for early 1942. A short burst would tear through the American aircraft's engine block, shred the coolant lines, and shatter the cockpit. Within 2 or 3 agonizing turns, the engagement was over. The American instinct to dogfight had just been weaponized against him. This was not an isolated tactical error. This exact geometric nightmare repeated itself day after day, week after week, across the entire theater. The casualty reports filtering back to Allied command headquarters in Australia were catastrophic. Fighter squadrons were being systematically decimated in a matter of days. In the sweltering, muddy operational tents at forward bases like Port Moresby, a dark, suffocating psychological cloud settled over the surviving air crews. They were reading the grim after-action reports. They were watching their squadron mates launch into the morning sun and never return. These young men were coming to a terrifying, paralyzing realization. Their machines, and more importantly, the very combat maneuvers they had spent hundreds of hours perfecting in flight school, were fundamentally mismatched against the enemy. It is a profound psychological burden to wake up, strap into a cockpit, and know with absolute certainty that if you act on your natural instincts under fire, you will be killed. The Japanese pilots knew it too. They began to actively exploit this dominance. They would deliberately slow down during an engagement, baiting American formations into turning contests, fully aware that the aggressive young Americans could rarely resist the challenge. The Japanese were dictating the terms of every single engagement, forcing the Allies to fight in the exact aerodynamic envelope where the Zero reigned supreme. Back in Washington, and at forward headquarters, genuine desperation set in. The Japanese Empire was expanding rapidly, threatening to cut the supply lines to Australia. The initial response from American military planners was to try and fix the symptoms rather than cure the disease. Ground crews in the field were ordered to strip every ounce of non-essential weight from the P-39s and P-40s. They removed heavy radios, took out extra ammunition, and stripped away specialized equipment, desperately trying to lighten the airframes to make them turn just a fraction of a second faster. Desperate pilots experimented with dropping their landing flaps in the middle of a high-speed dogfight to artificially increase wing lift and tighten their turning circle. But these were merely band-aids on a gaping arterial wound. You cannot shave 50 pounds of radio gear off a massive, liquid-cooled interceptor and expect it to suddenly dance with a purpose-built, featherweight dogfighter. The aerodynamic gap was simply too wide to close with field modifications. If a P-39 pilot managed to survive the first turn by dangerously dropping his flaps, he bled off so much kinetic energy that he was a sitting duck for the second turn. The math was absolute, and it was entirely in favor of the enemy. In a horizontal fight, the Zero would always win. There had been warnings long before the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. Claire Chennault, a brilliant but abrasive tactician commanding the American Volunteer Group, the famous Flying Tigers in China, had extensively studied the performance of the new Japanese fighters. He had sent urgent, explicit intelligence reports back to the United States Army Air Forces. Chennault recognized immediately that engaging Japanese fighters in a turning match was pure suicide. He relentlessly drilled his pilots to use the heavy weight and superior diving speed of their P-40s to slash through enemy formations from above, fire a quick burst, and dive away to safety. He strictly forbade them from ever entering a prolonged turning dogfight. But in the rigid, deeply traditional bureaucracy of the pre-war American military, Chennault was viewed as an eccentric renegade. His reports were filed away, largely ignored by high-ranking commanders who still arrogantly believed that the American way of dogfighting would easily triumph over what they incorrectly assumed was inferior Japanese engineering. By the spring of 1942, the bloody reality of the Pacific Air War had utterly shattered that arrogance. Relying on the raw bravery of American pilots was no longer a viable strategy. It was a recipe for the total extinction of Allied air power in the region. The United States was mobilizing its massive industrial base, but designing, testing, and deploying a completely new fighter aircraft takes years. The men fighting over New Guinea and the Solomon Islands did not have years. They had weeks. They could not pause the war and wait for engineers to build a plane that could miraculously outturn a Zero. Commanders were forced into a harsh, uncompromising reckoning. They realized that the crisis was not merely a hardware deficiency, it was a failure of geometry. As long as American pilots treated the sky as a two-dimensional, horizontal arena, They would continue to die at an unsustainable rate. To survive the Pacific, they had to stop playing the enemy's game. They did not need a better turning plane. They needed to fundamentally rip up the rulebook of aerial combat. They needed to abandon the horizontal plane entirely and force the enemy into a new dimension. The desperate need for survival had created a demand not just for a new plane, but for an entirely new dimension of combat. The instrument that would drag the war into this vertical dimension was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. When it arrived in the Pacific theater, it looked like nothing else in the sky. With its twin booms, central nacelle, and massive tricycle landing gear, its silhouette was visually shocking. But in the life-or-death calculus of aerial combat, aesthetics were irrelevant. What mattered was that the P-38 was not merely an airplane. It was a highly specialized toolkit engineered specifically to manipulate physics. It was the physical manifestation of pure energy combat. To dominate the vertical plane, an aircraft first requires the ability to reach it. The Lightning was powered by two massive 12-cylinder Allison engines, but its true secret weapon lay housed inside the twin tail booms. Lockheed engineers had equipped the engines with advanced, exhaust-driven turbo superchargers. While the Japanese Zero was optimized to dominate the air below 15,000 feet, where its naturally aspirated engine breathed easily, the P-38's turbos force-fed dense, pressurized air into the cylinders, even in the freezing, oxygen-starved atmosphere of the upper stratosphere. This allowed the Lightning to routinely operate at 25 to 30,000 feet. In this new doctrine of aerial warfare, altitude was no longer just a location on a map. Altitude was a bank account. It was a massive, untapped reserve of stored potential energy. The geometry of an engagement was no longer dictated by who could turn the tightest circle, but by who possessed the energy advantage before the fight even started. An American pilot, loitering in the thin air 3 miles above the jungle canopy, would spot a formation of Zeros cruising far below. Instead of descending to their level and merging into a horizontal wrestling match, the P-38 pilot would push the control yoke forward and enter a steep, plunging dive. This was where the brutal physics of the heavy American interceptor transformed from a fatal flaw into an unstoppable weapon. The immense weight of the Lightning, the armor plating, the heavy radios, the twin liquid-cooled engines, was suddenly accelerated by gravity. Potential energy violently converted into raw kinetic energy. The aircraft transformed into a 400-mile-per-hour sledgehammer falling out of the sun. The sheer speed of this descent allowed the American pilot to completely dictate the terms of the engagement. The Zero pilot could not run because he could not outpace a diving P-38. He could not initiate a turning fight because the American was moving entirely too fast to be caught in a turn. But a high-speed diving attack presented its own complex engineering problem. When an aircraft slashes through an enemy formation at terminal velocity, the pilot has only a fraction of a second to aim and fire. Traditional fighters like the P-40 mounted their machine guns in the wings, meaning the bullets had to be angled inward to converge at a specific distance ahead of the plane. If the enemy was closer or further than that exact convergence point, the bullets would harmlessly straddle the target. Lockheed's designers bypassed this problem entirely. They packed the P-38's complete arsenal: 4 50-caliber heavy machine guns and a 20mm autocannon, tightly together in the nose of the central cockpit nacelle. When the pilot squeezed the trigger, he did not fire a converging cone of bullets. He unleashed a concentrated, parallel stream of solid lead and high-explosive shells, acting like a chainsaw cutting straight ahead. A single, well-placed fraction of a second was more than enough to shatter an unarmored target. However, the absolute most critical component of this new vertical geometry was what the pilot did immediately after pulling the trigger. The natural, deeply ingrained instinct of a fighter pilot is to bank hard after firing, to look over the shoulder and visually confirm the kill. In a P-38, indulging that instinct was suicidal. A hard turn would instantly bleed off the aircraft's massive kinetic energy, slowing the heavy fighter down and placing it right back into the deadly horizontal arena where the Zero remained supreme. The new doctrine demanded ruthless, cold discipline. Strike and do not look back. After the firing pass, the American pilot was trained to hold the nose steady, using the immense momentum of the dive to either extend away at breakneck speed in a straight line or pull up into a sweeping, rocket-like climb, converting that speed straight back into altitude. The Japanese Zero was mechanically and structurally incapable of following the P-38 into this vertical domain. Jiro Horikoshi's ruthless weight-saving measures, which gave the Zero its supernatural turning ability at low speeds, became its fatal vulnerability at high speeds. The lightweight airframe lacked the sheer mass to accelerate rapidly in a dive. Worse, if a Japanese pilot attempted to follow a diving Lightning past 300 miles per hour, the dynamic pressure of the rushing air would overwhelm the control surfaces. The Zero's ailerons would physically lock up, freezing the stick in place. The aircraft became rigid, unable to maneuver. If the Japanese pilot pushed the airframe any further, the unreinforced wings threatened to violently tear away from the fuselage. And if the Zero attempted to pull its nose up to chase a P-38 rocketing back into the sky, its lightweight engine quickly ran out of breath, stalling out while the American vanished into the clouds. This was no longer a battle between two different airplanes. It was a violent collision between two entirely incompatible philosophies of flight. The lightweight, graceful elegance of horizontal maneuverability was being actively circumvented by the heavy, uncompromising physics of vertical energy. The Americans were no longer trying to outfence a master swordsman in a ring. They were dropping an anvil on his head from a third-story window. Yet, the physics of pure energy combat were, at this stage, still just a flawless mathematical theory visualized on a chalkboard. The brutal arithmetic of the vertical strike was logically sound, but it had never been executed at scale in the chaotic reality of the Pacific Air War. This radical new doctrine now had to be proven in the actual skies, face to face against the most lethal, seasoned combat veterans of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Transforming this chalkboard theory into a lethal, theater-wide reality required entirely reprogramming the minds of the men who would fly the machines. In the suffocating, malaria-ridden forward operating bases of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, the arrival of the P-38 Lightning was accompanied by a radical, almost authoritarian shift in squadron culture. 5th Air Force Commander General George Kenney and his tactical officers initiated a ruthless retraining program. Inside humid, canvas-roofed briefing tents, illuminated by flickering bare bulbs and thick with the haze of cheap cigarette smoke, aggressive young pilots were given an ultimatum. The old ways were dead. The romantic era of swirling, dogfighting combat was officially recognized as a form of suicide. The new rule was absolute, and it was drilled into the aviators with brutal repetition. You will climb, you will dive, you will fire, and you will extend. Under no circumstances, regardless of the temptation, regardless of how vulnerable the enemy looked, were they permitted to pull back on the control yoke and enter a horizontal turning engagement with a Zero. For the American pilots, this was an agonizing psychological barrier to overcome. They had been raised on the aggressive ethos of the pursuit pilot, to dive on an enemy, fire a burst, and then immediately flee at maximum speed felt fundamentally unnatural. To some, it even felt like cowardice. It violated every instinct of a young man desperate to prove his courage in combat. But squadron commanders were unyielding. If a pilot was caught trying to outturn a Japanese fighter and managed to survive the attempt, he was not reprimanded. He was often immediately grounded. The margins for error in the Pacific were simply too thin to tolerate ego. The pilots had to learn that in this new geometry of war, speed was not just a tool for travel, it was armor, it was stealth, and it was the only guarantee of survival. They had to become mechanical, calculating, and cold. This rigid new doctrine faced its first massive operational crucible in March 1943 during the pivotal Battle of the Bismarck Sea. The Imperial Japanese Navy desperately needed to reinforce its sprawling garrison at Lae, New Guinea, and dispatched a massive convoy of 8 troop transports escorted by 8 heavily armed destroyers. If these thousands of troops reached the island, the Allied ground campaign would face a bloodbath. To stop them, the 5th Air Force deployed everything it had. The tactical plan relied on heavy bombers and low-level attack aircraft, B-25 Mitchells and A-20 Havocs, skimming just above the wavetops to drop their bombs directly into the sides of the Japanese hulls. However, these low-flying, lumbering bombers were utterly defenseless against the umbrella of Japanese Zeros circling ominously in the sky above the convoy. This is where the P-38 Lightning and the new vertical doctrine were put to the ultimate test. Instead of flying closely alongside the bombers as a traditional escort, the Lightnings were staged miles above the fleet, orbiting in the freezing, thin air at 20,000 feet, banking on their turbo superchargers to maintain their massive energy reserves. When the Japanese fighter screen spotted the incoming American bombers and rolled over to dive on them, the trap snapped shut. The Lightnings fell from the stratosphere. They did not attempt to engage the Zeros in a swirling dogfight over the ships. Instead, they executed a series of relentless, high-speed slashing attacks straight through the Japanese formations. A P-38 would tear downward at over 400 miles per hour, unleash a concentrated buzzsaw of 50 caliber and 20 millimeter fire into a Zero, and instantly use its overwhelming momentum to pull up into a towering climb, completely untouchable. The geometry of the battle was chaotic, but strictly controlled by the Americans. The Japanese pilots were forced to break off their attacks on the vulnerable bombers just to survive the plunging Lightnings. If a Zero pilot banked hard to avoid a diving P-38, he preserved his own life, but he bled off his speed and lost his angle on the American bombers below. The Lightnings did not need to shoot down every Japanese fighter. They simply needed to use their kinetic energy to relentlessly disrupt the enemy's formation, rendering the Zero's maneuverability completely irrelevant. Kept safely at bay, the American bombers annihilated the convoy. All 8 transports and 4 destroyers were sent to the bottom of the ocean. The vertical strike doctrine had not just protected a few fighter pilots. It had systematically dismantled a major strategic naval offensive. Just 1 month later, this mastery of energy, altitude, and speed allowed the Americans to execute one of the most audacious, long-range fighter intercepts in military history. In April 1943, Allied naval intelligence, codenamed Magic, intercepted and decrypted a highly classified Japanese radio transmission. The message detailed the exact itinerary of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet and the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. He was scheduled to conduct an inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands, flying in a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, heavily escorted by a flight of elite Zero fighters. The intelligence presented American planners with a seemingly impossible geographic problem. Yamamoto's route would take him over the dense jungles of Bougainville, roughly 400 miles away from the nearest Allied airfield at Guadalcanal. No single-engine fighter in the Allied inventory had the range to fly that far, loiter, engage in combat, and make it back. The mission, dubbed Operation Vengeance, fell entirely on the broad shoulders of the P-38 Lightning. Outfitted with massive, twin 330-gallon external drop tanks, a hand-picked squadron of Lightnings took off into the humid morning air. To avoid detection by Japanese coastal radar, they had to fly the entire 400-mile outbound leg mere feet above the rolling swells of the Pacific Ocean, maintaining absolute radio silence for over 2 hours. The navigation relied entirely on dead reckoning, calculating time, speed, and heading over an endless, featureless expanse of blue water. The margin for error was non-existent. If they were off by 1 degree or a single minute, they would find nothing but empty sky. but the Lightnings arrived at the intercept point with terrifying precision. At exactly 9:34 a.m., the American pilots spotted the twin-engine Japanese bombers and their escorting Zeros descending toward the airfield. This was the absolute apex of the vertical doctrine. The American pilots dropped their heavy external fuel tanks, firewalled their throttles, and immediately began a desperate climb to convert their airspeed into altitude. By the time the Japanese escort fighters realized what was happening, the Lightnings had already seized the energy advantage. The P-38s did not try to weave through the Zeros. They executed perfectly calculated, high-speed diving passes directly onto the bombers. The Japanese fighter pilots, masters of the horizontal turn, instantly threw their Zeros into violent, evasive maneuvers, desperately trying to drag the Americans into a dogfight. But the Americans simply ignored them. The Lightnings slashed through the formation, their concentrated nose guns tearing the wing off Yamamoto's bomber and sending it plunging into the jungle canopy below in a plume of thick black smoke. The Zero pilots were left completely helpless in the air. They possessed the most agile machines on Earth, but they were moving too slowly to catch the retreating P-38s, which were already vanishing into the horizon at maximum speed. The greatest strategic mind in the Japanese military had been eliminated not by superior turning, but by superior reach and uncompromising speed. For the veteran Japanese aviators stationed at heavily fortified bases like Rabaul, this period marked the beginning of a profound and terrifying psychological decay. In the early months of the war, when the P-38 first appeared in the theater, many elite Japanese pilots had initially dismissed the massive aircraft. Viewing its twin engines, wide wingspan, and heavy silhouette, they incorrectly assumed it was a cumbersome, easily outmaneuvered bomber-type aircraft. They mocked its inability to turn, eagerly anticipating the slaughter. But as the months dragged on, the brutal reality of the American tactics settled over the Japanese squadrons like a suffocating blanket. The veterans, who had spent thousands of hours perfecting the ballet of the horizontal dogfight, suddenly found themselves fighting a ghost. A Japanese ace would be scanning the horizon, secure in the knowledge that no Allied aircraft could outfly him. Suddenly, tracer fire would rip through his formation from an impossible angle above. By the time he violently threw his control stick to the side and banked his Zero to engage, there was no enemy there to fight. The attacker was already a shrinking silver dot thousands of feet above, repositioning for another strike. It was a uniquely demoralizing kind of warfare. The Japanese possessed a razor-sharp sword, but they were fighting an enemy who refused to step into the arena, choosing instead to hurl stones from an untouchable tower. The Zero pilots could not force an engagement. They could only react. They were perpetually on the defensive, burning precious fuel and exhausting their mental stamina while waiting for an anvil to fall from the sky. The aerodynamic advantage that had defined their total dominance in 1941 had been systematically isolated and neutralized. The Zero had not gotten worse. The airspace around it had simply been weaponized in a way it was never engineered to handle. Ultimately, the P-38 Lightning was the spearhead that cracked the myth of Japanese invincibility, but it would not win the war alone. In the years that followed, the United States military machine would unleash a terrifying wave of industrial and technological might. The introduction of the rugged F-6F Hellcat and the immensely powerful F-4U Corsair, combined with advanced shipborne radar directing massive fleets of heavily trained replacement pilots, would eventually grind the Imperial Japanese Navy's air power into dust. But the vital foundation for all of those later victories was laid in those desperate, bloody months of 1942 and 1943. The radical doctrinal shift, the absolute refusal to play the enemy's game, and the elevation of combat into the vertical plane was the blueprint that allowed the Allies to survive long enough to bring that massive industrial weight to bear. The system crafted around the heavy American interceptor was, on paper and in disciplined execution, mathematically flawless. It had successfully dismantled the most feared fighter plane in the world by turning its greatest strength into an irrelevancy. But the entire doctrine rested on a razor's edge, because while the physics of energy combat were perfect, they were entirely reliant on the pilot inside the cockpit. The strategy contained a terrifying, invisible vulnerability. It required a young, adrenaline-filled aviator to maintain absolute, machine-like emotional control in the most chaotic, terrifying environment on Earth. The P-38 Lightning did not make its pilot invincible. In fact, it was one of the most unforgiving combat environments ever engineered, precisely because it required that adrenaline-filled aviator to fight against his own human nature. The American doctrine of energy fighting was flawless, only as long as the pilot remained completely disciplined. But combat is rarely clinical. When a young pilot dives out of the sun at 400 miles per hour, lines up a zero in his sights, and squeezes the trigger, he might miss. Or he might only damage the enemy. The instinct in that split second is overwhelming. The enemy is right there, banking away, seemingly vulnerable. The pilot's brain screams at him to pull the yoke back, drop the throttle, turn inside the enemy's arc, and finish the job. But the moment an American pilot surrendered to that instinct, the entire mathematical advantage of the heavy fighter instantly evaporated. If a P-38 pilot pulled hard into a horizontal turn, the massive drag of the airframe violently bled off his kinetic energy. His speed plummeted. He was no longer a 400-mile-per-hour sledgehammer. He was a sluggish, heavy target trapped in a low-speed arena. And waiting for him in that arena was the Mitsubishi Zero, just as deadly, just as agile, and just as capable of carving an impossibly tight circle as it had been on the very first day of the war. By simply losing patience, by giving in to ego or frustration for a fraction of a second, the American voluntarily handed the ultimate advantage right back to the Japanese. Surviving in the Pacific required an agonizing level of self-control. It meant diving into a chaotic, swirling sky of enemy fighters, taking a single high-speed shot and extending away, even if it meant flying straight and level while tracer rounds snapped past the canopy. It meant accepting that you had to walk away from a guaranteed kill if the geometry was wrong. This relentless psychological pressure was exhausting. Aviators were returning to their humid, mosquito-infested bases, not just physically drained from wrestling the heavy twin-engine controls, but mentally hollowed out. They were fighting a two-front war, one against the Imperial Japanese Navy and another against their own deeply ingrained egos. The men who survived were the ones who could suppress their pride and execute the math with cold, mechanical precision. No one mastered this cold precision better than Major Richard Bong. By late 1944, he had methodically pushed his score to an astonishing 40 confirmed aerial victories, becoming the highest-scoring American ace of the war. Bong did not achieve this by being a daredevil or a reckless gunslinger. His success was built on an almost robotic adherence to the rules of energy combat. He treated the P-38 as an instrument of geometry. He would meticulously calculate his altitude advantage, strike with devastating accuracy, and immediately use his momentum to escape, refusing to be baited into a turning fight, no matter how tempting the target appeared. His 40 victories were a testament to absolute, unyielding discipline. He proved that the doctrine worked perfectly, provided the pilot never broke the rules. But perfect discipline is an incredibly fragile foundation for a military strategy. It demands a level of flawless execution that is almost impossible to sustain indefinitely under the crushing pressure of combat. Every time an American pilot strapped into the cockpit, the Zero was waiting, hoping for just one lapse in judgment, one moment of impatience, one fatal decision to pull back on the stick and turn. And this terrifying reliance on absolute human perfection was destined to be tragically tested at the very pinnacle of the American ace leaderboards. The man who would test this fragile foundation to its absolute limit was Major Thomas McGuire. By the first week of January 1945, McGuire was a legend in his own right. With 38 confirmed aerial victories, he was the second highest-scoring fighter pilot in American military history, standing just in the shadow of Richard Bong. But unlike Bong, who had been permanently grounded by senior commanders and sent home to the United States just weeks earlier to preserve his life, McGuire was still in the combat theater, and he was acutely, agonizingly aware of the math. He needed just 2 more victories to tie Bong's record, and 3 to become the undisputed king of the American Air War. That towering ambition created a dangerous psychological undercurrent. The pressure to score those final kills weighed heavily on him with every single mission. The massive P-38 Lightning had kept McGuire alive through years of brutal combat, specifically because he understood how to exploit its kinetic energy. He knew the strict rules of vertical engagement intimately, but ambition has a way of corroding discipline, even in a master of the craft. On the early morning of January 7th, 1945, McGuire led a flight of 4 Lightnings on an aggressive, low-altitude fighter sweep over the Japanese-held airstrips on Negros Island in the Philippines. They were flying dangerously close to the jungle canopy, hunting for targets of opportunity that might be taking off or landing. Operating a heavy, twin-engine interceptor like the P-38 at low altitude inherently robbed the aircraft of its greatest weapon, gravitational potential energy. Down in the thick, heavy air near the ground, there was no altitude to dive from, no momentum to harness, and, critically, no vast, empty space to safely escape into if an engagement suddenly went wrong. As the flight swept over a Japanese airfield at Fabrica, they were suddenly confronted by a lone, highly maneuverable enemy fighter. The Japanese pilot, a veteran warrant officer named Akira Sugimoto, did not panic at the sight of 4 massive American aircraft. Instead, he instantly fell back on the deeply ingrained doctrine of his training. He hauled back on his control stick, dropping his wing and throwing his lightweight aircraft into an aggressively tight, horizontal turn directly toward the American formation. In a matter of seconds, the geometry of the sky completely inverted. Sugimoto's nimble fighter effortlessly sliced inside the wide turning radius of the American flight and snapped menacingly onto the tail of one of McGuire's wingmen. The trap that had systematically decimated American squadrons back in 1942 was suddenly laid out perfectly in 1945. McGuire found himself in the worst possible aerodynamic configuration. He was flying at low speed, at low altitude, and his aircraft was still carrying massive 160-gallon external fuel tanks beneath its wings, adding immense drag and dead weight. The strict, inflexible rules of energy combat dictated exactly what he had to do in this terrifying moment. He needed to push his throttles forward, extend away in a straight line, jettison his external drop tanks to shed the weight, use his massive engines to gain altitude, and then reset the geometry of the fight on his own terms. Instead, looking at the highly maneuverable enemy fighter threatening his wingman, and perhaps thinking of the 2 aerial victories he desperately needed for the record, McGuire made a fatal, uncharacteristic calculation. He broke the rule. Rather than extending away to build speed, McGuire violently banked his Lightning and pulled back hard on the control yoke, attempting to force his heavy, drag-laden fighter into a tight, low-speed horizontal turn to save his wingman. He was trying to outturn the master of the horizontal fight in the very arena where it reigned supreme. The laws of aerodynamics were unforgiving and immediate. As the P-38 banked sharply at low speed, with its heavy fuel tanks still attached, the airflow over the inside wing suddenly detached. The heavy Lightning shuddered and violently stalled. At barely 300 feet above the dense jungle canopy, there was absolutely no altitude left to trade for airspeed, and no time to recover aerodynamic lift. The massive P-38 snapped over, inverted, and plummeted directly into the earth. Major Thomas McGuire, one of the greatest aviators in American history, was killed instantly. He had not been defeated by a technologically superior machine. He had not even been struck by enemy fire. He had been defeated by his own ambition, by a momentary lapse in discipline that caused him to violate the single foundational law that had kept him alive for 38 victorious engagements. His tragic death on that Philippine island was a harsh, permanent validation of the fundamental truth discovered over Buna 3 years earlier. The Japanese horizontal turning doctrine had never stopped being lethal. The physics of the lightweight, highly maneuverable fighter remained an absolute death sentence the exact second an American pilot voluntarily agreed to play by Japanese rules. McGuire's fatal stall in 1945 proved that the machine Japan had built at the dawn of the decade was never truly rendered obsolete in its own domain. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero did not suddenly become a bad aircraft. The airframe did not degrade. The fundamental physics of its lightweight wings and its incredibly low wing loading remained a masterpiece of aeronautical engineering until the very last days of the war. Its lines were beautiful, its controls were feather-light, and its turning radius remained an absolute marvel of mathematical compromise. The Japanese aviation industry had successfully built exactly what it set out to build: the ultimate, uncompromising, horizontal duelist. Which brings us right back to the humid clouds over Buna on December 27, 1942, when a 22-year-old Richard Bong pushed the nose of his heavy, twin-engine P-38 Lightning into a dive, claimed his first 2 victories, and instantly vanished before the enemy could pull him into a dogfight. He was not just winning a skirmish, he was unveiling a terrifying new reality for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Bong's genius, and the tactical genius of the entire American air campaign that followed, was rooted in a very rare military trait: humility. The Americans looked at Jiro Horikoshi's masterpiece and openly admitted they could not beat it on its own terms. They accepted that the only way to survive against a master swordsman is to refuse the sword fight entirely. War is not a formalized fencing tournament with agreed-upon boundaries. The Americans recognized that perfection in one specific dimension becomes a fatal vulnerability the moment the enemy simply shifts the axis of the battlefield. By enforcing the strict, emotionally exhausting, and unyielding rules of energy combat, climb, dive, fire, and extend, the United States military systematically stripped the Zero of its context. They isolated its greatest strength and left it suspended in a vacuum. The Japanese possessed the tightest turning fighter in the world, but turning tight means absolutely nothing if the enemy you are trying to shoot is already a mile away and climbing at 400 miles per hour. History often attributes the Allied victory in the Pacific Air War solely to overwhelming industrial capacity. It is easy to look at the staggering output of American factories and conclude that the Japanese were simply buried under an avalanche of aluminum, sheer numbers, and newer, more powerful engines. But the men who survived the bloody, desperate months of 1942 and 1943 understood a deeper truth. The factories bought them the tools, but human adaptation is what won the engagements. The ultimate victory over the Zero was not achieved by outproducing the enemy, nor was it achieved by engineering an airplane that could outturn the Japanese fighter. The United States won because they engineered a fundamental, radical shift in thought. They looked at a perfectly designed weapon, acknowledged its lethal perfection, and then cold-bloodedly changed the rules of the environment around it, rendering that perfection utterly irrelevant. The defining tragedy of the Japanese air fleet was not that they flew a flawed machine. It was that they spent the entire war flying a functionally flawless machine in a game the enemy had simply stopped playing. In the end, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero was never actually outturned. When the war finally drew to a close, and the surviving Japanese airframes sat abandoned on cratered runways across the Pacific, they were still the most agile, gracefully balanced fighters ever constructed. Their aerodynamics remained an absolute marvel of engineering, but the American military had realized at the very edge of defeat that survival did not require building a better airplane to challenge the enemy's singular talent. It required the cold, mechanical discipline to completely deny the enemy the opportunity to ever use that talent in the first place. The profound tragedy for the Imperial Japanese Navy was not that their legendary fighter suddenly lost its agility, or that its brilliant design was somehow proven flawed. The tragedy was far more absolute. It was the crushing realization that the United States had systematically forced a new, vertical battlefield where the Zero's greatest, most terrifying capability simply no longer dictated who lived and who died. Japan had built the perfect weapon for a horizontal war, only to be utterly dismantled by an enemy who coldly refused to turn.